The evening had arrived with a soft chill in the air, carrying a gentle breeze through the glass doors of the luxury hotel. Inside, the dining hall was glowing with golden light, reflecting off the polished wooden floors and crystal chandeliers. The long dining table was set with precision, gleaming silverware, sparkling glasses, and plates arranged in perfect order. There was a quiet elegance to the room, one that whispered wealth and refinement, yet beneath it was a strange tension that seemed to hang in the air like an invisible curtain. Guests arrived one by one, their footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. They wore suits and elegant dresses, each carefully chosen to reflect their status. Smiles were exchanged, polite nods given, but behind the etiquette, a subtle competition brewed. Each person seemed to measure the other, silently gauging who held more influence, who had more wealth, who had the power to impress or intimidate. Amidst all this, one presence stood out, not because of extravagance, but because of her quiet stillness. The young Japanese heiress sat at the head of the table, her posture poised and graceful. She wore a simple but stunning dress that shimmered slightly under the chandelier light. Her hair was neatly tied back, and her eyes carried a calm, almost mysterious depth. She was known among the elite, not just for her family's immense wealth but also for her intelligence and discerning nature. Yet tonight, despite the luxury surrounding her, she remained alone, her attention gently following the movements of the other guests but not engaging with them. Conversations buzzed around her like bees around a flower, but no one dared to approach directly. A few whispered comments floated her way, subtle glances exchanged, yet the isolation persisted. There was a strange hesitation in the air, a quiet reverence mixed with uncertainty. The guests admired her from afar, yet nobody seemed brave enough to break through the invisible wall that separated her from the crowd. It was as if the very act of speaking to her carried a weight too heavy to bear. As the first course was served, the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain filled the room. Waiters moved with practiced precision, their footsteps light, their movements almost choreographed. Plates were placed before the guests, each dish a small masterpiece, delicate in design and full of vibrant colors. The scent of freshly cooked delicacies filled the air, blending with the faint fragrance of flowers that decorated the table. It was a feast for the senses, yet the atmosphere remained surprisingly tense, almost fragile. The heiress reached for her fork, her movements fluid and composed. She sampled a bite of her dish, her expression unreadable but serene. Around her, the guests continued their polite chatter, but it lacked warmth. There were jokes and compliments, small talk about business ventures and recent travels, but the words seemed hollow, more like a performance than genuine interaction. The young heiress listened quietly, nodding occasionally, yet her gaze often drifted to the window, where the city lights sparkled in the night. A few guests attempted to make eye contact, offering soft smiles or subtle nods, but each attempt seemed to falter. There was an unspoken rule, a fear of making a misstep, that kept everyone at a distance. The heiress noticed this, though she did not show discomfort. Instead, she remained calm, observing the human behavior around her with quiet curiosity. She had grown accustomed to this kind of environment, where admiration often came wrapped in fear and distance. Meanwhile, in the background, the staff moved efficiently, attending to every need without drawing attention. Among them was a young waitress, new to the hotel but confident and alert. She carried herself with a natural grace, balancing trays of food with ease, her eyes scanning the room for cues. Unlike the guests, she was not bound by the unspoken rules of social hierarchy. She noticed the heiress immediately, recognizing the subtle loneliness that even wealth could not mask. There was a softness in her gaze, an instinctive understanding that went beyond status or money. The waitress continued her rounds, offering a polite nod to the guests, her presence quiet yet noticeable. She had been trained to maintain professionalism, to serve without intruding, but there was something different about this particular table. She sensed the tension, the isolation of the young heiress, and it sparked a quiet determination within her. She wanted to do more than serve food. She wanted to bridge the distance, to acknowledge the humanity of the person sitting alone amidst a crowd of admirers. As the main course was presented, the heiress's eyes met those of the waitress for a brief moment. There was no conversation yet, just a recognition of presence, a silent acknowledgement. The heiress's expression softened ever so slightly, a subtle shift that went unnoticed by the others. The young waitress moved on, serving the other guests with grace. But that small connection lingered, an unspoken promise that someone was paying attention in a way that mattered. The evening continued with the same delicate balance of elegance and tension. Guests sipped wine, discussed trivial matters, and exchanged polite compliments, all while the heiress remained a quiet center of attention, observed but not engaged. The waitress, meanwhile, moved with purpose, attentive to details, noting the heiress's reactions, the slightest shifts in her demeanor, the way her eyes followed certain conversations. She understood that this dinner was more than a display of wealth. It was a test of human interaction, of courage and kindness, even in the smallest gestures. Despite the grandeur of the room, the glittering lights, and the carefully orchestrated service, there was a palpable sense of something missing. The guests were impressive, their achievements significant, yet the warmth of genuine connection was absent. The heiress, for all her grace and beauty, seemed to float above the pretenses, aware of the emptiness beneath the surface. She ate her food slowly, savoring each bite, her mind wandering between observation and reflection. She noticed the polite smiles, the measured laughter, the careful navigation of social boundaries, and she felt a quiet melancholy. It was in these small, unnoticed moments that the evening held its true tension. The heiress was surrounded by wealth, power, and influence, yet she was profoundly aware of the loneliness that often accompanied it. She was accustomed to being admired but rarely truly seen. She noticed the subtle performances, the cautious movements, and the careful words chosen to impress rather than connect. It was an intricate dance of human behavior, and she was an expert observer, yet she longed for something authentic, something real. The young waitress, moving through the room, was unaware of how much she had already caught the heiress's attention. She was focused on her duties, on serving with skill and care, yet there was an instinctual understanding guiding her actions. She moved with confidence, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence both quiet and impactful. There was a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something unexpected could happen, a small spark of possibility in an otherwise controlled environment. As the first part of the dinner drew to a close, the tension remained, but the air seemed slightly lighter. The heiress, for all her stillness, carried a quiet hope within her. She had been observed before, admired from a distance, but there was a subtle difference tonight. A new presence had entered the room, someone who saw her not as a symbol of wealth or status, but as a person. That recognition, even in its smallest form, planted a seed of anticipation, a tiny flicker of curiosity about what might come next. The candles flickered softly, casting warm shadows across the table. Glasses were refilled, plates cleared, and the rhythm of the dinner continued. Guests chatted, laughed, and maintained their social facades, but the heiress remained the calm eye in the center of the storm. And somewhere in the midst of it all, the young waitress moved with purpose and quiet courage, unaware that her simple attention and respect were about to change the course of the evening in a way no one could have predicted. The soft glow of the chandeliers reflected on the polished table as the second course was brought in. The dishes were even more intricate than the first, with delicate arrangements of vegetables, fish, and sauces that made the plates look like pieces of art. The guests murmured their admiration politely, but the true focus of the evening remained the young heiress at the head of the table. She continued to sit gracefully, her posture perfect, her hands folded briefly before taking up her cutlery. Yet despite the beauty surrounding her, a subtle air of loneliness persisted, a quiet gap between her and the others. The new waitress moved carefully, balancing her tray as she approached the table. Her eyes briefly met the heiress's, and she noticed the small, almost imperceptible sigh that escaped her lips. It was a quiet expression of the weariness that came from being constantly observed but seldom truly seen. The waitress felt a surge of empathy, a human connection that went beyond her professional duties. She had served many people before, but something about this moment felt different, significant, almost like a small chance to do something meaningful. She placed the plates gently in front of each guest, ensuring that everything was perfectly aligned. When she reached the heiress, she hesitated for only a moment before speaking, softly and clearly, in the young woman's native Japanese. The words were simple but warm, a polite greeting that carried a subtle charm. The heiress looked up sharply, her eyes widening slightly. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. The other guests noticed the flicker of surprise but did not understand what had been said. They exchanged glances, puzzled, as if unsure whether to intervene or ignore the moment. The heiress's lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. It was the first genuine expression of emotion she had shown since arriving. The waitress, noticing the change, allowed herself a small, controlled smile in return, maintaining professionalism while acknowledging the connection. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a silent recognition that for the first time that evening, the heiress felt truly seen by another person. As the guests continued their conversations, the heiress started to engage more. Her responses were brief but thoughtful, and they carried a warmth that had been missing before. The waitress stayed nearby, offering water refills and subtly adjusting the placement of cutlery, yet never intruding on the dialogue. Each movement, each glance, seemed to convey respect and understanding rather than mere service. The heiress noticed the difference immediately. She had grown used to people who admired her wealth or social position, but rarely someone who treated her simply as a person. The atmosphere around the table began to shift in small, almost imperceptible ways. Other guests began to notice the changes, the light in the heiress's eyes, the softening of her posture, the way her responses seemed more relaxed and natural. Some tried to continue their usual small talk, but the energy of the table had subtly altered. There was a new focal point, a human warmth that had not existed before. The young waitress, unaware of the ripple effect she had created, continued her work diligently, her movements precise and elegant. With the third course approaching, the heiress started to ask questions, quiet but curious. She inquired about the ingredients, the preparation, the story behind certain dishes. The waitress responded patiently, her tone friendly and sincere. She spoke in a way that was informative yet approachable, never condescending. The heiress listened intently, nodding, her eyes reflecting genuine interest. The other guests watched, intrigued and slightly embarrassed, as they realized that a simple waitress had managed to capture the attention of the heiress in a way they could not. This interaction sparked a subtle transformation in the room. The polite, distant conversations among the other guests began to soften. Some leaned in slightly, attempting to engage the heiress with more warmth. Others, noticing her relaxed demeanor, felt a small nudge to show genuine interest rather than performative admiration. It was a quiet revolution of human connection, led not by wealth or status, but by empathy and attentiveness. The heiress's confidence grew with each passing moment. She smiled more freely, asked questions with curiosity rather than formality, and even laughed quietly at a subtle joke from one of the guests. The waitress continued to move around the table, attentive but unobtrusive, her presence a constant reminder of sincerity amidst a room of carefully curated appearances. She had found a balance between service and engagement, providing the heiress with both attention and space, allowing the young woman to emerge from her shell without pressure. A subtle tension that had lingered since the start of the dinner began to dissolve. The guests, who had initially been wary of approaching the heiress, noticed the change in her demeanor and began to relax. Polite smiles became warmer, conversations more natural, and the rigid formality of the gathering softened. The room seemed to breathe a little easier, the invisible barrier around the heiress slowly fading, replaced by a gentle, human connection facilitated by someone of no status in comparison to the wealthy elite. The heiress's gratitude, though quiet, was evident in her eyes. She looked at the waitress with an intensity that conveyed both surprise and appreciation. It was a recognition that went beyond words, a silent acknowledgement that someone had seen her as a person rather than an heiress or a symbol of wealth. The waitress, in turn, maintained her composure, responding with a subtle nod, a professional smile, and a gentle tone, never breaking the unspoken etiquette of the room, but still providing the human warmth that had been missing. The main course was cleared, and dessert was presented, delicate pastries with vibrant colors and intricate designs. The heiress sampled each one, her enjoyment genuine and visible. She shared her thoughts quietly with the waitress, commenting on the flavors and textures, and the conversation flowed naturally. The other guests watched, their own interactions with the heiress now tinged with curiosity and admiration, as they realized that the heiress was responding not to wealth or status, but to kindness and genuine human attention. As the evening progressed, the heiress began to share small stories about her experiences and travels, her tone light and engaging. She spoke of places she had visited, people she had met, and moments that had left an impression on her. Her voice carried warmth, a stark contrast to the formality and distance of the earlier part of the dinner. The waitress listened attentively, occasionally nodding or offering brief, thoughtful comments, allowing the heiress to take the lead in the conversation. The dynamic of the table had shifted entirely, and the room now hummed with a quiet sense of connection. By the time the dessert plates were cleared, a remarkable change had taken place. The heiress, once isolated and distant, now radiated a calm confidence and approachable warmth. The other guests had adjusted their behavior, engaging with sincerity rather than performance. The young waitress, though still performing her duties, had facilitated this transformation through her attention, empathy, and courage. She had bridged a gap that wealth, status, and social etiquette could not, proving that genuine human connection is far more powerful than outward appearances. As the evening drew to a close, the heiress subtly leaned forward, offering a small but meaningful smile to the waitress. It was a smile that conveyed gratitude, recognition, and perhaps a hint of surprise at how much impact a simple act of attentiveness could have. The guests, witnessing the interaction, were left with a quiet understanding that the evening had become memorable not because of opulence or prestige, but because of a small, human gesture that broke through layers of formality and isolation. The young waitress moved away to continue her duties, unaware of the profound effect she had had. She had served with diligence and care, but her presence had offered something far greater: acknowledgement, respect, and a bridge between two worlds that rarely met on equal terms. The heiress, now relaxed and genuinely smiling, reflected on the evening with a quiet sense of relief and appreciation. She had experienced a rare moment of being truly seen, and it had transformed her experience of the dinner completely. The room, once tense and formal, now felt alive with warmth and subtle joy. Conversations flowed naturally, laughter was gentle and sincere, and the invisible barriers that had separated the heiress from her guests had been softened by the presence of someone who had dared to be genuinely kind. The evening continued, filled with small moments of connection, subtle gestures of attentiveness, and the quiet triumph of empathy over etiquette, status, and fear. As the evening progressed, the room continued to glow with the soft light of chandeliers, and the scent of the meals lingered pleasantly in the air. The heiress had grown more comfortable, her posture less rigid, her gaze more open, and there was a sense that the invisible walls surrounding her were slowly dissolving. She observed the room with quiet curiosity, noticing the details, the way the guests shifted slightly in their seats, the careful attention of the staff, and, most importantly, the constant presence of the young waitress who moved around the table with effortless grace. The waitress had been attentive from the very beginning, but now there was a subtle shift in her approach. She had noticed the heiress's subtle reactions, the little signs that indicated interest or approval. When she approached with the next course, she smiled warmly and spoke directly to the heiress in fluent, perfectly natural Japanese. Her tone was friendly but respectful, and the words were not merely polite. They were engaging and personal, crafted in a way that showed understanding of the heiress's preferences and culture. The heiress's eyes widened in surprise. The clarity and warmth of the language, combined with the unexpected familiarity, caught her off guard. She had often been surrounded by people speaking Japanese, but rarely with such fluency, care, and subtle charm. It was as if the waitress had unlocked a door that few had dared to approach. Her fingers paused mid-reach for the cutlery, and a faint smile spread across her face. The room seemed to hush for a moment, the other guests unsure how to react to this unexpected display. The waitress continued with gentle confidence, asking a few polite questions about the heiress's preferences for the dishes in front of her. She inquired about seasoning and flavors, listening intently to the responses and making subtle adjustments where needed. Her attention was both natural and intuitive. She did not treat the heiress as someone to impress, nor as someone to serve mechanically. She treated her as a person, something rare in an environment dominated by status and social hierarchy. The heiress responded, her voice soft but lively, and there was an unmistakable warmth in her tone. For the first time that evening, she felt a true connection with someone in the room. Her previous reserve melted slightly, replaced by curiosity and genuine interest. The other guests, noticing the interaction, watched in astonishment. A simple waitress, someone who held none of the social power in the room, was able to engage the heiress in a way they could not. The table, once formal and tense, began to shift subtly as people adjusted their attention and tone. As the conversation continued, the heiress started to reveal small details about herself, her travels, and her interests. She spoke with a quiet enthusiasm, sharing observations about the dishes, the presentation, and the subtle flavors that made each plate unique. The waitress responded thoughtfully, drawing on knowledge that was precise yet accessible, always careful not to dominate the conversation but rather to enhance it. Each word was chosen with care, showing respect and intelligence, and the heiress responded with increasing openness. A soft laughter escaped the heiress as the waitress made a gentle joke about a flavor combination, lightening the atmosphere. The sound was musical and unexpected, causing several of the guests to glance up, realizing that this was not a typical social interaction filled with pretense. It was genuine, human, and heartfelt. The heiress's smile lingered, and she looked directly at the waitress with an expression that conveyed appreciation and surprise. There was an unspoken acknowledgement that this simple act of communication had a profound impact. The other guests tried to re-engage, offering polite comments or questions, but their words felt flat in comparison to the sincerity of the interaction before them. Some leaned in, attempting to participate more naturally, while others quietly observed, realizing that status and wealth were no substitute for genuine human connection. The heiress, aware of the subtle shift in energy, continued her dialogue with the waitress, her comfort and confidence growing with each passing minute. During a brief pause in the conversation, the heiress asked a question about a particular Japanese term used on the menu, curious about its origin and meaning. The waitress, without hesitation, explained not only the literal translation but also its cultural significance, weaving in small anecdotes and historical notes. The heiress listened intently, nodding, clearly impressed by the depth of understanding and thoughtfulness. She was astonished that someone from outside the elite circle could communicate with such insight and authenticity. This moment marked a turning point in the dinner. The heiress leaned slightly forward, her body language relaxed and inviting. She was no longer just a figure of wealth observed at a distance. She was a person engaging with another, genuinely enjoying the conversation. The waitress maintained her professional composure but allowed the warmth of her personality to shine through. Her calm presence and respectful dialogue created a space where the heiress felt safe to be herself, free from the pressures of status and expectation. The subtle astonishment that the heiress felt soon spread through the room. Guests who had been observing cautiously began to murmur quietly among themselves, acknowledging the unusual yet captivating interaction. They realized that true influence did not always come from wealth or social standing. Sometimes, it came from courage, intelligence, and the willingness to engage sincerely. The heiress, usually reserved and measured, was now openly responding to someone who had no obligation to impress her, yet had done so through thoughtfulness and skill. As the main part of the meal came to a close, the heiress continued to converse with the waitress, asking questions about her experiences, family, and work. The waitress responded with humility and honesty, offering glimpses into her own life without overstepping boundaries. Their conversation was a delicate balance of curiosity, respect, and shared humanity. The heiress laughed softly, asked thoughtful follow-up questions, and even offered small anecdotes from her own life, creating a dialogue that felt natural and unforced. Throughout this interaction, the other guests were compelled to pay attention. They witnessed a unique connection forming, one that transcended the rigid social dynamics of the dinner. The heiress's engagement was not based on admiration or obligation. It was rooted in genuine interest and respect. The waitress, in turn, navigated the conversation with skill, demonstrating empathy, intelligence, and poise. The dynamic at the table had shifted completely, and the room felt alive with a new energy. When the final course was served, a selection of delicate desserts, the heiress spoke to the waitress again, commenting on the presentation and flavors with thoughtful detail. The waitress responded in kind, her voice calm yet engaging, noting subtle differences and highlighting nuances with care. The conversation flowed effortlessly, a clear contrast to the formal, measured exchanges that had characterized the beginning of the evening. The heiress's eyes sparkled with genuine curiosity and enjoyment, and the guests around them could not help but take notice. In a quiet moment, the heiress leaned forward and thanked the waitress directly, her tone sincere and heartfelt. The simple act of acknowledgement carried immense weight, conveying gratitude, surprise, and respect. The waitress responded with a modest nod and a gentle smile, her demeanor unchanged, yet her impact undeniable. She had bridged a gap that no wealth or status could overcome, creating a human connection that left a lasting impression. As the evening drew on, the heiress remained engaged, conversing with renewed confidence and warmth. The other guests, inspired by the interaction, began to adjust their own behavior, attempting to connect more genuinely. The atmosphere, once formal and tense, had transformed into one of subtle warmth and human connection. The heiress's astonishment at the waitress's language and attentiveness had not only softened her own demeanor but also subtly influenced the entire room. By the end of the third part of the dinner, the heiress had experienced something rare. The simple joy of being seen and heard as a person, not merely as an heiress or symbol of wealth. The waitress, through her language, empathy, and courage, had created a bridge of understanding and respect. The other guests, now quietly reflecting on the scene, recognized that the evening's most memorable moments were not the extravagant dishes or luxurious surroundings, but the authentic human connection that had formed at the table. The young waitress had astonished everyone, not with wealth or status, but with her ability to see and engage with someone genuinely, and in doing so, had transformed the entire experience of the dinner. The room had transformed from the stiff elegance of a formal dinner to a space that hummed with quiet warmth. The initial tension, the polite distance, and the careful calculations of status had softened, largely because of the subtle courage and attentiveness of the young waitress. The heiress, once isolated and distant, now radiated a gentle openness, her smiles more frequent and her conversation flowing naturally. Guests, noticing this shift, began to adjust their behavior, letting go of the rigid etiquette that had governed their interactions. The waitress continued her rounds, maintaining her graceful balance between attentiveness and discretion. She approached the heiress with the next course, a delicate dish of seasonal vegetables and tender fish, artfully plated with sauces that seemed to flow like brushstrokes across the plates. She spoke softly, again in the heiress's native language, asking if the flavors suited her taste and offering small, thoughtful suggestions. The heiress responded with warmth, her voice carrying a sense of genuine engagement that caught the attention of the entire table. The other guests, previously unsure of how to interact, began to notice the transformation. They saw the heiress leaning slightly forward, listening with interest, responding with curiosity and subtle humor. There was a lightness in her manner that had been absent before, a sense of ease that suggested the invisible barriers had been lowered. The presence of the waitress had acted as a bridge, not only connecting her to someone in the room, but inspiring others to approach with sincerity rather than formality. Small conversations began to spark across the table. A guest, inspired by the heiress's engagement, asked her opinion on a recent cultural exhibition. The heiress, her voice calm yet animated, shared her thoughts, surprising the room with both her insight and her warmth. The conversation felt natural, human, and unforced, a stark contrast to the earlier formalities. The guests, sensing the authenticity, began to engage more genuinely, their questions thoughtful and their tone relaxed. The waitress continued her attentive service, moving between tables with poise, her presence quiet yet impactful. She did not dominate the conversation, nor did she seek recognition. Her influence was subtle, felt more than seen. She offered the heiress gentle guidance, answered questions with knowledge and patience, and allowed the conversation to flow naturally. Each word and gesture was purposeful, creating an environment where the heiress felt comfortable, respected, and understood. As dessert was served, the atmosphere had softened completely. The heiress commented on the flavors, textures, and presentation, her voice carrying enthusiasm and curiosity. The guests, inspired by her openness, joined in, sharing their own observations and experiences. Laughter began to ripple through the room, soft but genuine, as stories were exchanged and small jokes made. The once stiff and formal dinner now felt alive, a gathering not of status and performance but of shared humanity. The heiress, noticing the change in the room, smiled warmly at the waitress. There was a silent communication in that glance, a deep acknowledgement of the role the young woman had played in shifting the energy. The waitress responded with a quiet nod, her smile professional yet infused with kindness. She had facilitated a subtle revolution at the table, one that allowed the heiress to emerge from her isolation and for others to engage sincerely. The guests, now observing the heiress's ease, found themselves reflecting on their own behavior. They realized that their initial distance had been a product of fear, not respect. The heiress had not been unapproachable because of arrogance but because of experience. She had learned that most interactions were dictated by status and expectation rather than genuine interest. The waitress had disrupted that pattern, showing that kindness, attention, and courage could open doors that wealth alone could not. As the conversation deepened, the heiress shared small anecdotes about her life, her travels, and the moments that had left a lasting impression on her. She spoke of her family traditions, the lessons learned from observing people, and the importance of authenticity in a world often dominated by appearances. The waitress listened attentively, occasionally offering small insights or gentle observations, allowing the heiress to guide the dialogue while subtly encouraging engagement. The guests, inspired by the exchange, began to interact more naturally. They asked questions not to impress, but to understand. They listened with attention, nodded with genuine interest, and offered comments that were thoughtful and human. The rigid boundaries that had separated them from the heiress began to dissolve, replaced by a shared sense of curiosity and respect. The dinner, which had begun as a formal display of wealth and social status, had become a space for meaningful connection. A subtle shift occurred as the heiress looked around the table. She noticed the other guests' attempts to engage sincerely and responded with grace and warmth. There was laughter, gentle teasing, and shared observations that created a rhythm of interaction previously absent. The atmosphere was no longer dictated by hierarchy. It was guided by genuine human interaction. The waitress, continuing her attentive service, became a quiet anchor, ensuring the flow remained smooth and natural. Throughout the remainder of the dinner, the heiress remained engaged, her demeanor calm yet lively. She asked questions about the dishes, the traditions behind them, and even the preferences of the guests. Her voice carried curiosity and openness, creating an environment where others felt comfortable to share their thoughts. The once distant guests now leaned in, contributing to conversations and building connections that went beyond surface-level etiquette. The young waitress moved with precision and grace, balancing her duties with subtle influence. She offered suggestions for the presentation, provided small cultural insights, and maintained an awareness of the room's shifting dynamics. Her presence was gentle but commanding in effect. She guided the flow without overtly directing it, allowing the heiress and the guests to engage naturally while ensuring that the interactions remained respectful and sincere. As the evening drew closer to its end, the heiress's gratitude became more apparent. She looked at the waitress, her eyes reflecting appreciation and acknowledgement. There was a depth to her gaze, a recognition that went beyond the simple act of service. The waitress, maintaining her professional demeanor, responded with a subtle nod, a quiet smile, and an awareness of the profound impact her actions had created. The guests, observing the interaction, found themselves reflecting on the importance of sincerity and human connection. They realized that the evening's most memorable moments had not come from the luxury of the surroundings or the intricacy of the dishes, but from the authentic engagement facilitated by someone who had no obligation to impress. The heiress's openness and warmth had been unlocked by a simple yet courageous act of empathy and attentiveness. In those final moments, the room felt lighter, more connected, and infused with a quiet joy. The heiress, once reserved and distant, now radiated calm confidence and approachable warmth. The guests, inspired by the transformation, engaged more genuinely, creating a rhythm of conversation that was both relaxed and meaningful. The young waitress, though still performing her duties, had orchestrated an invisible shift, bridging the gap between status and humanity with her courage and skill. The dinner concluded on a note of subtle celebration, not of wealth or social power, but of human connection, empathy, and courage. The heiress had experienced the rare joy of being seen and appreciated as a person, not merely as an heiress or symbol of wealth. The guests, having witnessed this transformation, reflected quietly on their own behavior and the importance of sincerity in interaction. The young waitress, unaware of the full extent of her impact, had become the silent hero of the evening, demonstrating that genuine kindness and attentiveness can transcend social boundaries and create moments of profound connection. The dinner had reached its final moments, yet the room was far from quiet or tense. The atmosphere had shifted completely from the stiff formality that had characterized the beginning of the evening to one filled with warmth, laughter, and genuine engagement. The young Japanese heiress sat at the head of the table, her posture relaxed, her eyes bright, and her voice carrying a gentle confidence that drew people in. She spoke with sincerity, her words thoughtful, and she laughed softly at small jokes, her presence commanding yet approachable. Throughout the evening, the guests had experienced a subtle transformation. The initial hesitation and careful politeness that had dominated the room had given way to conversations that were meaningful and human. People had begun to engage with each other genuinely, listening, asking questions, and sharing experiences in a way that had been absent earlier. The heiress's openness had inspired others to participate sincerely, and the room had become a space where hierarchy mattered far less than honesty, attentiveness, and respect. The young waitress, who had been quietly guiding much of this change, moved with calm efficiency, balancing her service with the presence she maintained at the table. She refilled glasses, cleared plates, and offered small suggestions, all while maintaining a professional yet warm demeanor. Her actions were understated, yet the impact of her engagement was profound. She had bridged the gap between the heiress and the guests, and her genuine attentiveness had created a space where human connection could flourish. As the final desserts were served, the heiress turned her attention fully to the waitress. Her eyes reflected gratitude and recognition, a silent acknowledgement of the subtle courage and empathy that had transformed the evening. The heiress spoke directly to the waitress, asking about her life, her experiences, and her own impressions of the dinner. The waitress responded humbly, her tone sincere, offering small insights and reflections without overstepping. Their conversation was a delicate balance of respect, curiosity, and warmth, and it left an impression on everyone at the table. The other guests observed in quiet admiration. They saw the heiress engaging with someone who had no status or power in the room, and they realized that this interaction carried more influence than any formal title or social standing ever could. There was a subtle lesson being demonstrated, that kindness, attentiveness, and courage in human interaction could transcend barriers of wealth and hierarchy. The room was no longer about appearances or status. It was about connection, understanding, and respect. The heiress shared small stories from her life, moments that had shaped her, and experiences that had taught her the value of sincerity. She spoke of her travels, the people she had met, and the lessons she had learned from observing the world. Her words were thoughtful and reflective, carrying both humility and insight. The guests listened with genuine interest, inspired by the honesty and openness she displayed. Laughter and gentle conversations flowed naturally, creating a rhythm of interaction that was authentic and human. The young waitress continued to navigate the table with poise. She offered thoughtful comments, encouraged the heiress to elaborate on her stories, and subtly guided the flow of conversation without dominating it. Her presence was a quiet anchor, ensuring that the dialogue remained respectful, engaging, and meaningful. The heiress responded with increasing warmth, clearly comfortable in the space the waitress had helped create. For the first time that evening, she felt fully at ease, able to engage with others without pretense or caution. As the dinner drew to a close, the heiress looked around the table with a newfound appreciation for the people present. She recognized the subtle efforts of those who had shifted their behavior, inspired by her engagement and the waitress's example. The room, once tense and formal, now felt alive with human warmth and genuine interest. Conversations continued, laughter rippled softly, and a sense of shared understanding pervaded the space. In a quiet moment, the heiress turned fully to the waitress, offering a heartfelt expression of gratitude. Her voice was soft yet sincere, conveying appreciation for the courage, attention, and empathy that had made the evening possible. The waitress responded with a modest smile, a subtle nod, and a professional yet warm tone, acknowledging the recognition without seeking praise. It was a moment of genuine connection, a bridge between worlds that rarely interacted on equal footing. The guests, witnessing this exchange, reflected on their own actions and attitudes. They realized that much of their initial hesitation and formality had been rooted in fear or the desire to impress, rather than genuine engagement. The evening had demonstrated that true connection arises from authenticity, attentiveness, and kindness, and that these qualities could inspire respect and admiration far more effectively than wealth or status alone. They observed the heiress engaging naturally, her curiosity and warmth guiding the conversation, and they felt a quiet shift within themselves as well. The young waitress, unaware of the full extent of her influence, continued her duties with calm efficiency. Yet her actions had created a ripple effect that transformed the entire evening. The heiress's openness inspired others to engage sincerely, and the room, once dominated by social boundaries, became a space of shared humanity. The simplicity of attentiveness, courage, and empathy had proven more powerful than any formal display of wealth or influence. As the last plates were cleared, the heiress rose slightly, offering a small smile and a soft nod to the guests. It was a gesture that conveyed warmth, appreciation, and the subtle joy of having experienced a rare human connection. The guests responded with polite smiles, but these were tinged with genuine reflection and recognition. The young waitress remained poised, having facilitated a remarkable transformation without fanfare or recognition. The evening ended on a note of subtle celebration, not of wealth, status, or accomplishment, but of authentic human engagement. The heiress had been seen, heard, and respected in a way she rarely experienced, and the guests had been reminded of the power of sincerity and attentiveness. The young waitress, through her courage, skill, and empathy, had created a space where genuine connection could thrive, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. As the guests departed, there was a quiet sense of fulfillment and reflection. They carried with them the memory of an evening transformed not by grandeur, but by the simplicity of human connection. The heiress, now relaxed and approachable, had experienced the rare gift of being acknowledged as a person rather than an heiress, and the young waitress had become the silent catalyst for this profound shift. It was a testament to the power of attentiveness, courage, and kindness, and the lasting impact of treating people with genuine respect and empathy. The dinner, once a formal event filled with tension and distance, had evolved into a memorable experience of shared humanity. The heiress, the guests, and the young waitress each left with something more than a meal. They carried the quiet lesson that true connection is built not on status or wealth, but on authenticity, empathy, and the courage to engage genuinely. The evening would be remembered, not for the luxury, the grandeur, or the delicacy of the dishes, but for the human warmth and understanding that had transformed every interaction at the table. leaving a lasting impression on everyone who had been present.